How would you answer the following question? What happens to supply and producer surplus when innovations increase productivity among the least productive producers or identical sellers enter the market? Let me give you a second to think about that before I tell you the answer. Well, one thing is that this will rotate the supply curve clockwise when the largest cost reductions are for the highest marginal cost producers, such as improved yields in low quality farmland, or entry into an industry by identical sellers or producers. What are some examples of applications that fit this rotation in the supply curve? Well, drought-resistant seeds, efficient irrigation technologies, optimal irrigation timing, deficit irrigation and no-till practices. Likewise, fracking for gas mainly lowers the cost of high cost producers. Offshore drilling is very expensive to drill into the deep sea. So new technologies that lower costs of our low productivity producers such will do that. Farm insurance can reduce the expected marginal cost of production since insurance provides benefits to low productivity, high cost agricultural producers. Innovations that are adopted in the same proportion by producers with different marginal costs but are not adopted by all producers can cause the supply curve to rotate. And we already talked about entry into an industry by identical producers rotates the supply curve. Here's our supply curve. C is the intercept, and we can change our intercept of our supply curve up here. E is the slope of the supply curve, demand curve. A is the intercept. B is the slope. When the supply curve has an intercept that is positive, the supply curve is elastic. Unit elastic is when the supply curve's intercept is 0. And I didn't show the 0 supply curve, but yeah, the intercept would be right out of here. In this case, I'm showing a negative intercept, which means it's an inelastic supply curve. Two other cases would be perfectly elastic when the slope of the supply curve is 0, as we are showing here. In this case, notice everything is consumer surplus. Another case would be a perfectly inelastic supply curve when the supply curve is a vertical line. For the demand curve, when this is our total revenue down here, when total revenue is increasing up to here, that means the demand curve is elastic up here. When the demand curve, so in this case it looks like 10, so right here would be the largest total revenue possible when the demand curve, the elasticity of demand, and it looks like I accidentally had supply, but it's unit elastic demand when total revenue is at its maximum point. Now let's show our producer surplus. There it is, there's our producer surplus. Notice the maximum producer surplus I can get is up here at 10 units because, or actually not maximum I can get, but maximum output I can get is 10 units in this example. And so as we, let's go up here and change our slope. So, and let's show our current producer surplus. So notice our current producer surplus is increasing. It reaches a maximum and then starts declining. So there we have it. And what we find in this case is producer surplus increases in this range right here when the slope of the supply curve is greater than the slope of the demand curve. Likewise, when we have an elastic supply curve, producer surplus reaches a maximum when the slope of the supply curve equals the slope of the demand curve. In other words, when let's actually make the slope of the supply curve So we'll change this slope to, let's say, 2, because it looks like the slope of our demand curve is 2. And there we have it. There we are at our maximum point down there, and here we are with our largest producer surplus. So let's show that again. So producer surplus reaches a maximum when the slope of the supply curve equals the slope of the demand curve. Only when it's elastic though. And likewise, producer surplus decreases when we have a negative. So let's play that into and start having decrease. And there we have our producer surplus decreasing down there. And here we have it increasing again because now producer surplus is steeper than, the slope is steeper than the demand curve. Now let's look at the supply curve when it is inelastic. So let's change it. Let's change this up here to negative 10. Okay, there we are, inelastic. Notice the producer surplus, it is a lot higher now that we're inelastic, a lot more producer surplus that the sellers can capture. And also notice that in this case, that at first producer surplus increases when the slope of the supply curve is greater than the slope of the demand curve. But eventually producer surplus reaches a maximum. Let's change our slope here. So here we are, producer surplus is increasing. It's going to be reaching a maximum out here somewhere. And then it starts decreasing. So, and also I should mention, producer surplus declines when E is equal to B, or likewise when the E is less than B. In other words, the slope of the supply curve is less than the slope of the demand curve. Now let's look at consumer surplus. What do you think is going to happen to consumer surplus as we have these innovations that rotate down? Well, let's take a look at it. And there's consumer surplus, increases at an increasing rate. So in each case, the consumer surplus, this area up here, is going to be increasing because of innovations or the entry of new firms. Let me, just for ease of showing, let's now take a look at producer surplus. Actually, let's leave in consumer surplus for a second. Total surplus, this orange line, is, there it is. And in this case, there's our total surplus is equal to our consumer surplus plus our producer surplus. So over here, if we don't sell anything, 0 consumer surplus, 0 producer surplus, 0 total surplus. Over here, we have no producer surplus, but we have total surplus, and it all is consumer surplus. So that's what our total surplus is. The general relationship when supply is inelastic, and here inelastic, remember, is when the intercept is less than 0. Total surplus increases at a decreasing rate, so there it is, decreasing rate, until the good is not scarce, so people can get all they want for free. The more inelastic the supply curve, the lower the intercept, and the larger the total surplus. So there we have it, and that's what it looks like in this case. Now let's look at it when we have a positive intercept for the supply curve. So up here, let's change it to 20. There's our positive intercept. And up here, when supply is elastic, total surplus increases at a constant rate. There it is, increasing at a constant rate. And that's, as much as we can produce. We could actually probably drop off the consumer surplus curve up here, but we have a constant rate up to where the supply curve is perfectly elastic, which is straight up here, and perfectly elastic. So let's put it at 0. And there we have it. So there it's perfectly elastic. We have no producer surplus. Everything is consumer surplus right there. Now, I think it's really interesting if we look at what happens to, let's click on this line over here, maximum producer surplus is right there. And what happens to a curve? And I'm going to take off my, just so we can see it better, our total surplus and my consumer surplus. So notice what happens, and let me bring this over. That is the maximum, this is the points of all the maximum points on our producer surplus. And it looks like that's our unit elastic for on our demand curve. And it looks like total revenue producer surplus can actually be increasing even when total revenue is declining a little bit over here during part of the backward bend. Let's show that. So up here, and in this case, we'll want to change C. Actually, let's change it up there. And notice as we come up here, that I'm changing, in this case, the intercept. And when I get an intercept that's more and more negative, producers receive more and more of the total producer surplus. So let's bring it back again. Well, let's pause it. And then let's bring it back all the way over there. So in this case, we have a supply curve where costs are so high we can't produce anything. Now let's start our animation here. So here we are. Now this case, notice I'm changing the intercept, so I'm making it more and more inelastic. And as we become more and more inelastic, more and more of the producer surplus overall is going to be belonging to our producers. So it's nice when you have a very inelastic supply curve. You make more producer surplus. So what have we learned from this? Well, a couple things that we've learned is, one thing is, if the supply curve becomes more horizontal, the cost advantage of your high quality land and agriculture or your more productive producers is also reduced. And historically, innovations are constantly reducing marginal production costs that have, in our marginal productivity regions, such as these new farming techniques that have made areas that were not as productive much more productive than they used to be. Likewise, who would have thought of going thousands and thousands of feet below the ocean in order to drill for oil and gas or fracking? These have changed the world. Likewise, interestingly enough, that in a competitive market, all innovations benefit consumers and society as a whole, since total surplus increases. But not all innovations may benefit producers. Many innovations may reduce producer surplus, but still society's better off in a competitive market. Good to talk to you. Talk to you later.